So hello everyone. If Thomas was talking about how to exclude possible noise or possible confounding factors from outside the brain, this is about confounding factors from inside the brain, which are the peripheral potentials. And I'm going to focus on pharmaco-TMS EEG, because that's something that has been going on the lab for some time. And it's very easy to find, first of all, very easy to find meaningful results in TMS EEG with pharmacological experiments, and also to find how these peripheral potentials or PEPs can actually impact your research. And I'm going to start mentioning that, well, you do your TMS EEG and you find a lot of things. And one of the things that you find and has been identified ever since the method of TMS EEG has been developed is that by applying a pulse, you also evoke sensorial evoke potentials, because it is a click, it's a noise, it is a somatosensory input, so you're bound to also evoke a sensory potential. I don't know why, but the thing is, this was identified and somehow people just shrugged off and said, okay, yeah, and kept on doing TMS EEG. Not much attention has been paid to that, because later, when applying, okay, let's do the TMS EEG and compare it with the realistic sham, trying to apply the same sensory input as the TMS, what was found is that, well, it's very similar. So what if what we're seeing with TMS EEG is simply sensory evoked response? Well, that'll be complicated, because then what we're doing is meaningless. You can just do the same thing with a click sound. You don't need a TMS machine. So what gives? Is there really a response from the cortex from doing TMS? So let's take a step back and try to think, what are these sensory evoked activities? Well, yes, there will. If you make a click sound, you will find the sensory cortex very shortly after the stimulus in the sensory cortex a response, low amplitude one. But more strikingly, you will find this typical N100 and P200, which are of larger amplitude, and which seem to be independent of the sensory stimulus. It can be an auditory stimulus, somatosensory one, even visual stimuli can evoke this N100, P200, which this is nothing to do with TMS EEG. This is people doing psychophysics. They say, okay, it's most likely a multilocal supramodal response to sensory inputs. It's possibly the modulation of attention to incoming stimulus, which very much occurs in TMS EEG. You have many sources, many possible sources of different sensory input, from the click sound, the stimulation of nerve endings, the cranial muscles that twitch when you do TMS. So there are a lot of things to control for. And how do these impact on your study? Well, you might be tempted to think, well, I'm doing TMS EEG. Suppose that I'm going to do it pre and post a certain intervention. And you say, well, okay, I will see these sensory evoked potentials, but then they'll simply cancel out once I compare pre and post, right? So let's see here. On your left, you have a study on subjects with ADHD compared to healthy controls, and they found a significant decrease in the amplitude of the N100 when applying TMS EEG in subjects with ADHD compared to the healthy controls. And so if both evoke sensory potentials, they cancel out, and I'm seeing here a true TMS EEG. The same thing, we might think, well, if I take a bunch of healthy subjects, here the study on the right, I give them a GABA agonist, some benzodiazepines, and by doing so, after the intake, I see a decrease in the N100 amplitude after the medication. And since I say all the sensory potentials cancel out, I'm good to go. Well, are you though? Because that will not be true if these conditions not only modulate your TP, but also modulate your sensory evoked potentials. And well, these studies, they did not use any sham control of any sort, so you cannot exclude this possibility here. What you might want to think about is that, okay, has there been studies prior on specifically sensory evoked activity and these potentials? Because as I mentioned here, the existence of these potentials is not new. You've known about them for quite some time. Maybe some people have made some studies comparing the difference in the amplitude of that N100 and, for instance, the intake of benzodiazepines. And they have. And they show that the N100 is decreased in amplitude after it. So maybe this thing here is not the modulation of TMS-EG potentials, it's simply the modulation of sensory evoked activity. And the same thing goes for the ADHD. Same kind of studies showing difference in sensory evoked activity in subjects with ADHD. So this is very serious. We have to find a way to properly control for these responses. And there has been some developments on this, and I'm going to try to summarize those. First, thinking about click sound, how to control for it. Masking noise. If there's a click, if I give masking noise that can obscure this click, great, I'm set for it. And for this, I super recommend the tag. It's very nice. I'm using it myself now. I like it a lot.
Agreed.
Still, we know that for some subjects, especially if you need high intensity in TMS, you still hear beyond this click, beyond the noise, a click, which you say, well, maybe that is also creating some sensory evoked responses. So you might want to combine with a sham coil. So in addition, you use a sham coil or a real coil that's tilted, something to also simulate the click sound. But that does not take into consideration the somatosensory input, because, okay, if you simulate low intensity on the vertex, it's, in most cases, you cannot feel anything. But if you're stimulating the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, I mean, you're bound to have a significant twitch, and that is somatosensory input. You have to think about it, maybe control it. And the classical way is to use electrostimulation. You put some electrodes on the scalp between the EG electrodes to create a muscle twitch and a sensation. And if you do this, you just created a realistic sham for your experiment. Now, this is very nice. The thing is, it's very difficult to create an ideal sham, because the thing is, it is different. And I'm also talking this from my own experience, as a subject. If you try to apply different kind of conformations of electrical simulation, you might get close, but it's never the same thing as the TMS. You always feel like, okay, this is different. I see what you guys are trying to do. Yeah, it's kind of, but it's still different. I can still tell the difference. And if you do this, and there is still a difference, you risk this. You risk that the possibility that you want to control it with the realistic sham, but they will still be kind of different. And the result from comparing the two is that, oh, you find a significant difference, but it's actually just some sensory evoked activity. So how can you control for this? Well, if you use a higher intensity sham, a higher intensity electrical simulation, well, you're not going to do yourself any favor. You're just going to invert the direction of your findings, because one is still going to be different than the other. Ideally, you'll do this. Ideally, you'll find a sham that creates exactly the same sensory evoked activity as the real without the actual cortical stimulation. And the thing is, how? I don't know. As I said, this is hard. And this is why, for the moment, I gave up. And what I try to do is the following. Is saying, well, what if I use an electrical simulation as the sham on both conditions? If I want to compare the sham and the real, I use a high intensity scalp electrical simulation on both real and sham. Now, why the hell would I do this? Well, it's based on the power law of sensory input, which it's a psychophysics concept, which is if I deliver sensory input, if I increase it linearly, the neurophysiological response will not be linear, it will be logarithmic. Which means that if I increase the sensory input high enough, eventually the neurophysiological response, the difference in the neurophysiological response will be minimal, maybe negligible, so that I can do this. I can actually subtract the real, which will contain a considerable sensory evoked potential, which will be comparable to the sham, and I then compare the two, and I'll find the difference is only the TMS evoked activity. And I try doing this, I try to find this perfect spot where the sensory evoked potential kind of saturates. And using this setup, I found that this tends to occur when the electrical stimulation reaches an intensity of around four times the individual's sensory threshold. And say, okay, if I have this now, I can then apply it. And by doing so, I compare the sham and the real. And in the end, I find the typical components that make up the TMS evoked potentials from the motor cortex, and specifically around this, around the stimulated area, which also includes a potential between 100 and 200 milliseconds that was previously obscured by the massive N100. Okay. Then let's go back and say, okay, can we then apply this to try to solve the question about the benzodiazepines? Benzodiazepines, do they modulate real TEPs or do they modulate sensory evoked potentials? Both. They seem to, this is not a surprise here. If I do this, if I give diazepam and just look at the data from the sham, I see a considerable suppression of the N100. Nothing new there. We knew this before. It's just that, yeah, it happens. It will also happen in the real one, because again, the real also has a considerable amount of sensory evoked potential. But if I then subtract it and compare it the pre and the post, then I'll see that first of all, that some results that were seen before in the early potentials, the around N45 and P60, the significant increase on the amplitude. Oh, I see it here too. And I also see differences that are not quite the N100, but they are modulating effects on this potential between the N100 and P200, but specifically in the motor cortex. And with this in hand, we can try to apply to other kinds of studies. So our student, Yufei Song, is trying to do the same thing and trying to look at the TMS evoked potentials from other regions in the SMA and the angular gyrus. And by applying this, she was also been successful in finding some potentials which are different from what you expect when you stimulate the motor cortex. But then again, they're not supposed to be the same because it's a different area, different cortical conformation. You'll have different TMS-CG responses, which you can see if you properly subtract the sensory evoked responses, because you see this is sensory evoked responses. What you get is what once you clean it from that. And you can do the same thing with medication. So she selected these targeted areas because she's trying to see changes from delivering medication to the subjects. So what happens to these TMS evoked potentials if you give them acetylcholine antagonists? But first of all, you have to make sure that these medications are also not changing the sensory evoked activity, because again, those can be modulated, and then you have a false conclusion and say, hey, this is modulating the TMS evoked. Well, no, it's modulating the sensory evoked potentials. And yes, if she had not used a proper sham condition, she would have found a difference that's actually simply the sensory evoked potentials, because they do modulate the N100 and P200. But by properly controlling for this, she has been seeing some effects on biparity. By now, she hasn't found anything scopolamine, but then again, this is just ongoing. Maybe when she finishes up data collection, we'll have some more interesting results. Good. So, do I think that this is the right way to go? Let's all do this perfect. No, I think this is something preliminary. We can do better. How we can do better? Well, maybe, again, if we find a way to do this, to find a perfect, idealistic sham that does that, that'll be even better. Because one of the problems of doing this optimized super electrical simulation thing is that inevitably it'll lead to a big artifact in the EEG response, which will require you to interpolate a big chunk of the data, which will make you lose early potentials. So that is why in our study, we did not see anything before 30 milliseconds. It's not because it's not there, but it's probably because we had to cut off a big chunk of it, interpolate, and well, we lose that data. If we can find a way to not use such a big electrical simulation intensity, we might be able to save these potentials and increase the amount of data that we have access to. So this is why this is something that I just started doing. Try to create an individualized sham optimization procedure, which is this. What if I do some real TMS and say, okay, from this real TMS, I get 40 pulses and I can calculate online the amplitude of this sensory evoked potentials. And I say, okay, for this individual here, using this coil, using this intensity, this target, I see that the amplitude is X, is say 8 microvolts. All right, what if I then do the electrical simulation and start titrating it until I find the intensity that evokes a potential of that amplitude? If I say, okay, this is going to be the sham, and then I do it, I can then compare the real TMS EEG without the addition of more electrical simulation and a sham that will accurately capture the amplitude of the sensory evoked potential from the real. I can then subtract it, and then voila, I get it. And this is what I've been trying now. And another thing is that, well, maybe I've been using subtraction, arithmetical subtraction. Maybe that's not ideal. Another possibility that Thomas alluded to is to use SSP SIR to then remove these components. Maybe that'll do a better job. And well, still see some things here in the P200. But before that, the results seem to be encouraging. And if I compare the results that we got from the from this individualized calibrated sham with a very high intensity electrical simulation in both conditions, I see that the results are very much comparable. So this is some possible future direction to this. But take-home message: be careful about this sensory local activity. But if there is a solution, we can find a way out. All right.
Thank you very much.